What's up, brothers and sisters? Your brother G World 7_D. And I'm back with the book Ancient and Modern Britons, Volume 1. I was trying to find my book dealing with the Highlanders, all right, because they were here in America. And the Highlanders from Scotland were Negroes, but despite what you see in these Hollywood movies, they try to portray them as white, but they were Negroes. The Lowlanders were white people. But I'm going to go to my book, though, Ancient and Modern Britons. I'm going to discuss a little bit of Scotland, all right? And the one page 198. It is. So I'm gonna read a little bit of it. This book is torn up. This is a good book to get. This book was written back in the late 1800s. Okay, now here we go. Since we see that the people known to us specifically as the Picts, the Picts of Claudinian, with a black complexion, it becomes a question whether their chief allies, the early Scots, were not of a kindred hue. The two nations are the two nations are invariably linked together in all records of the Roman conquest, and their chief historian at present day seemed to regard them as akin in blood. He tells us also that the Pictish inhabitants of ancient Argyll were, by one writer, styled Scoti Picti, or painted Scots, and that the occasion on which the Scots proper first make their appearances in history is when, in conjunction with the nation particularly styled Picts, they begin a series of fierce inclusions, incursions into Roman Britain in the year 360 AD. The districts of the main island, which the marauding Scots selected as the scene of their depredations, consisted of part of the mountain region of Wales on the coast opposite to Ireland, from whence they came. It is now known by most people that the early Scots had, at first, very little to do with that portion of our islands now distinguished by their name. That Scota, prior to the 10th century, was Ireland and Ireland alone. It is one of those propositions which, Mr. Skene maintains, lie at the very threshold of Scottish history, and the Gildas, writing in the Scots 2 centuries after the date of their first recorded advent, characterize them as shameless Irish robbers. This expression of British monk would appear to hit off the chief characteristics very fairly. It is under this guise, as the land pirates and water pirates, that the Scots proper, like their fellow robbers, the Picts, are visible everywhere in history and tradition. The appellation, the appellation is to believe by some to have been given them by their civilized foe, and to be contemptuous term, signifying vagabond. Gildas, at any rate, has no respect for them, as the following quotation will show. The Romans being drawn home, there descend in great crowds from the little narrow bores of their carles or carts, wherein they were brought over Stytic Vale, above the middle of summer, in the scorching hot sun, a dusky swarm of vermin, or a hideous crew of Scot and Picts, somewhat different in manner, but all like thirsting at the blood, who finding that their old confederates, the Romans, were marched home and refused to return any more, put on greater boldness than ever, and possessed themselves of all north and remote parts of the kingdom to the very wall, as if they were the true proprietors. These reminiscences of the South British monk suggest several things, not at least important being the impression conveyed by the last words of the preceding sentence. It is evident that the Gildas regarded himself as a descendant of a race that had dwelt in Britain, or at least its southern portion, long before the arrival of either Scot or Pict. It is true that this may mean nothing more than that, in the eyes of Ireland and North Britain, were foreign countries, and the expression transmarine nations used by him and by the venerable Bede in speaking of Picts and Scots is indeed held to refer to the residents in Ireland and the part of Scotland lying to the north of the Forth and Clyde, which, being at that date almost separated from larger and southern part of the island, was nearly as transmarine as Ireland itself. But the words of Gildas may bear a wide significance. The latter portion of the sentence just quoted is translated by another writer. I'm going to skip a little bit further, all right, because I want to emphasize who the hell these Negroes were, all right? Go over here, and we're going to focus on right here, all right? And we go right here. It is pretty clear that although allied to open quarrels, still used in Wales, fashions of some materials, yet the skin boats in which these various practical races ventured out to sea and performed voyages of several days' durations could not have been of the same eggshell formation, or they would have been swamped by first chopping sea they encountered. Let it be remembered that, by the several lines of argument indicated to some extent in various chapters, scientific men have reached the conclusion that a race not unlike the modern Eskimo inhabited certain parts of Western and Northwestern Europe at about the dawn of the Christian era, and it will be seen that those sea coils were themselves not unlike the kayaks of modern Eskimos, or not exactly like them. There would be nothing surprising in the fact that this was really the case. I shall point out subsequently. In the meantime, it is sufficient to content with the assumption that the Eskimo kayak and the Scythian sea coils were identical, grounded on the fact that no other shape of skin boat could live in the temperate sea. Thus, the Picts and Scots may have been transmarine nations in a very wide sense, since by many links they are connected with either Scythian nations more remote from southern Britain than they were. The Silures and the Spaniards of their time were seen to be both Picts, and they, along with other indigenous British tribes, inhabited interior England and large part of modern Scotland, as well as black and painted races of Ireland, were also shown to have possessed many common characteristics and to have closely resembled each other in several physical traits. These are all Negroes. And the Picts and Scots, specifically so named, although each title appears to have been a general nickname and nothing else, may thus have been transmarine, not only because they dealt on the further side of Irish Sea and the Firth of Darkness, that, save for the mountain range that skirts the eastern side of Loch Lomond, which have severed the bulk of Scotland from the larger section of the island, not only because they were apparently of kindred of more distant Picts of the Spanish peninsula and the island of Ostry-Mandes, but also because they themselves, the Picts of the British Isles, are traditionally said to have come originally from that part of Scythia, lying on the eastern side of the North Sea, the exact locality fixed upon by some being no other than the Chersonese Cimbria, that promontory that is now called Fluteland, out of which some centuries later issued the Black Danes, or the Cimbri, so that the Picts proper and the Black Danes, being Picts and both Moors, are being black strangers, or the Dub Gauls, in the sight of the white races of Britain, coming, as they appear to have done, from the same locality, present themselves as not in probability akin. So far, however, we have only decided, with regards to the early Scots, that they were the associates of the swarthy, practical, painted races, or let me say the swarthy, pyrical, painted races of a black Eskimo or a Negrito Mongoloid strain, without reaching the conclusion that the Scots themselves were the same complexion. But this seems to be distinctly pointed out by Gildas when he chronicles the arrival of the Dusky swarm of vermin or hideous crew of Scots and Picts, somewhat different in manners, but all alike, thirsting at the blood. The indifferent translation, which I have quoted from, does not enable us to see those invaders as clearly as we might, but another version is more exact. The precise words used by the monkish chronicler are those Titra and Scotrim, Pictoric, the black herds of Scots and Picts. There is no ambiguity in the words. The writer himself, it is almost certain, a white man, was recording an event that had happened only 2 centuries before his time. He was also in the position of a 20th century Briton describing the Battle of Plessis, or the Bostonian of today, picturing an attack of the Wyandots, or the Nascaret. Excuse me. Better than these, he had likely enough seen one of the more members of the race he was describing, which either of these superstitious historians might easily have failed to do. Therefore, when he speaks of the black herds of Scots and Picts, we have every right to believe that in so speaking of them, he's depicting them truly. The 4th century Scots, then, being undistinguishable from the general black herd that made up the Scoto-Pictish army, who themselves are the same complexion as the Picts proper. That is to say, they also were Morai or Moors. Okay, I'm going to stop there for the most part, and I'm gonna say this now. And the simple fact is that so-called black people were the original people, or all the people occupying different regions of Europe. The British Isles, as you know, which is the UK, modern day UK, which you have modern day Great Britain, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Then I'm going to bring in Ireland, France. All the area of Europe was populated by black people. And I kept mentioning transmarine, whereas the fact is that a lot of those brothers and sisters created small boats to travel to different places, even basically around the world. So you had those black Scots, those black Vikings, and those other black groups travel to different parts of the world. So they weren't landlocked. So you had different, when I mentioned before, there was different types of Negroes here in the ancient Americas. There were different types of so-called Negroes that was here in the ancient Americas, or black people, or heavily melanated people, who traveled around the world, who traversed around the damn world, the planet. So we have to understand that. And that's why there's other stuff I want to read, but I want to find my book dealing with the Haydn and the Scots, who were Negroes themselves. But that's the little thing I want to show right there, to emphasize, is the people who originally occupied the British Islands were black. Remember, King James is the king of not only England or Britain, but is also the king of Scotland. All right, those black Scots, like I said, so many other videos, were heavily here in Americas. So they mixed in with a lot of the Aboriginal black Indians who were already here. So you have to truly understand that Europe, what is now called Europe today, Europa, was once all black itself. So once you start understanding that, and once you you should know that North Africa was black, so-called black, heavily melanated, whatever. Once you start understanding that, you can basically put all the pieces together and to bring it together. Sorry for the mispronunciation of certain couple words. I was trying to read this stuff fast, all right? But I want you to understand and how to pick up. Like I said, once you understand that Europe was once black, remember, Europe is separated from Africa only by so many miles. Spain is only so many miles separated from Morocco. And then you have other parts of North Africa not far from Southern Europe. So it's obviously those people were so-called heavily melanated black people because North Africa was black. So all you gotta do is put that together. Say, okay, if you're gonna admit that North Africa was black, you gotta admit that, okay, Southern Europe was black. Now, some people when it went higher up into Europe, so that was black. So you gotta use common sense in order to come up with this information. This stuff I didn't get overnight, but once I started using common sense and started looking at visuals, I started to pick up on a lot of things. And white folks, they're good at not only lying, but they do a lot of name changes and distortion, like Aztecs, which is not the original name and stuff like that. They do a lot of name changing and then taking different things and then making them to different events when they're basically the same different events, but just happen at different times. So different wars that was happening, but just it just happened in different periods of time in the same region, but they give it different names. They're good at that. They're good at lying and distorting history. And you really need to understand that there's so many people haven't done no research. They just say we're African. We're not African, man. You got to stop that. We're not African. We are descendants of the indigenous, aboriginal, heavily melanated people who are already here, and a lot of black European with their surname. We don't have slave names. We have those black European surnames. So you have to understand that. And like I said, they came over here. King Charles II, King Charles I, like I mentioned, King James, King George, all these were Negroes out of Europe. And I just read you black Scots, all right, and Picts. All right, and I mentioned a little bit of the black Danes. These were all Negroes who were in Europe. So we have to really fully understand this issue. I showed you a picture of one of the books with the pictures of the coat of arms showing those black royal families who ruled Europe. And some stupid Negro or a white person. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Those are Africans. Oh, shut your ass up, man. Those are indigenous black Europeans. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't no different movement from people from North Africa and Asia and Americas migrating, and they're basically selling the seas and traveling to different lands. We've always done that. But you have to understand, though, is the fact is that we was doing this before even any other so-called race existed. But so many of our people, they have not studied. They don't care to study. They don't try to study this information. They want to be slaves from Africa. That's a problem. That is a major problem. You just want to be slaves from Africa, and you ignoring your true history because you refuse to learn your true history because you want to go by what some Negro taught you, which that Negro learned from some Negro, what that other Negro learned from some white person. And then they get multiple degrees in it and think they know every damn thing. You can't teach them nothing. They feel that everything they've learned, master told them everything, and that's it. Instead of doing the critical research on their own and gathering up the information, breaking everything down, putting it all together, and then present it to you in a format, in a way that's teaching it properly and correctly, instead of teaching that you a damn slave. All right, brothers and sisters, I'm gonna read this real part real quick, then I'm gonna end it, man. I'm gonna read this part real quick. Here, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna read this little section right here real quick. However contradictory this deduction may appear, it must never be forgotten that the people who made Scotland an independent nation were not Scots. The Bruces, the Wallaces, the Stuarts, and many other lesser names were Normans and Flemings. All right. It is true they identify themselves with earlier races and readily assume the name and some of the ideas of the adopted country. For men and very chameleons in their aptitude for taking a local color, but they were not Scots. The rank and file of their followers may have been Scottish. Some of their leaders were so. For example, the good Sir James, the most loyal of all the Bruce's knighthood, but he came of a race that boasted its ancient aboriginal blood and that bore a surname which signified the black man. And he himself, although by his time the family of Douglases had, likely enough, made more than one alliances with the whites, because there's so many invading whites that was coming in. And many of those black people died due to it was a black plague. And then some of them was being executed and killed and forced out of it. He himself was of a black and swart complexion, according to Godscough, for which cause he was known to his foes as the Black Douglas. Thus, although his high birth and all the chivalrous qualities attributed to him by Barbour rendered him a splendid specimen of a brave and courteous gentleman, and although he died in battle with the Saracens of Spain, he was actually in some degree a Moor or Saracen himself. And further, this Moorish blood have run in the veins of the chiefs of the house for fully a century after his death. For the Black Douglases, or those Liddesdale, retained the headship of their clan until the year 1455. All right, when they were overthrown and their estates forfeited in favor of this younger and rival branch of Angus. And it became a saying in allusion to the complexion of the two races that the red Douglases had put down the black. But although the Douglases, another tribe, belonged to a race that by one name or another preceded the Normans, yet the prime movers in the struggle that ended in Scotland independent were not Scots. The two great historic figures of that era were not Scots. Neither were the first of the royal Stuart race. At Bannockburn, Norman fought Norman, and Fleming. And when the Bruces had reached the summit of their power, and Edward Bruce made the haughty discovery that Scotland was too little for his brother and him also, his chief generals in the Irish campaign were kindred Normans, such as Sir Philip Mowbray and Sir John Stuart, of others of the race of Sir Neil and the Fleming. Of course, it is not to be understood that these two were the only white races at the time in the country, or that they constituted the greater portion of the two armies of Bannockburn. Centuries before this period, Britain was known to be inhabited by swarthy Moors. Centuries before this period, Britain was known to be inhabited by swarthy Moors. Centuries before this period, Britain was known to be inhabited by swarthy Moors. Whether these were found among the Cornish Demina and the Scottish kindred of the Forth marshes, or elsewhere in the British Islands, and coeval with them with their fair-headed Celto and men of the stamp of the white-skinned barbarian prisoner. These, again, have been reinforced from time to time by inroads of black heathens and white heathens, more or less akin to either party, and mingled nations have fought and intermarried, have formed leagues of amity, and broken them. During all the 1,500 years that stretched from Caesar's landing to the achievement of Scottish independence, and consequently of our predecessors of the 14th century, must have belonged to many varying types, whose differences were at that time sharply defined in those of unmixed blood, and blended in every possible permutation in that hybrid population that must have been inevitably arising, so that the Battle of Bannockburn, the combatants on either side must have belonged to many races, whether they fought in the ranks of the so-called English army or of the so-called Scottish. That in the latter army they were many more pure Scots cannot be doubted, the most distinguished of these being the swarthy Douglas Knight. But historical records tell that their leaders belonged to other races, and these races must have been largely represented in the ranks also. Professor Skeets draws attention to the fact that the Dutch or the Flemish mercenary soldiers helped to fight the battles of Normandy, and that those Flemings settled in great numbers in various parts of England, while grace at certain Scottish pedigrees reveals that North Britain, also the Flemish invaders, appear as the allies of the Normans, with whom they shared the fruits of conquest, land, and power. In Mr. Skeen's sketches of Galloway during the centuries prior to Bannockburn, he indicates a similar movement there. The Scots of Galloway, like the Moors of Morayshire, are seen rising up in rebellion against Norman barons, the vassals of the purely or partially Norman king. And whether in north or in the south, the rebellion is crushed, and great numbers of the rebellion slain. The country now called Scotland had not yet attained a national existence, but in its most important parts, a newer power was making itself felt, and the Normans and the Dutch were among the chief ingredients of this power. The Battle of Bannockburn, then, was not won by Scots proper alone, by the greatly mixed multitude of which they formed a part. Many of the leaders were, no doubt, Scots, although the more distinguished were chiefly non-Scottish, and none among them, of whatever race, excelled that famous Scot, the Black Douglas. It will be difficult to find a better example of Scots proper, and accordingly to its worth, while it look at him and his lineage a little more closely. He belonged to the oldest sept of his clan, that known as the Black Douglases, a term which proves to be tautological, which analyzed such Douglas signifies the black swarthy man. Their origins is shadowy, but one tradition states that the first of the family distinguished himself by his bravery in battle against Donald the White, a Norseman of the 8th century. From the half-mythical figure down to the good Sir James, who fought in Bannockburn, there is a fall of nearly 600 years. Time enough for any amount of changes in the race. Indeed, there is a hint that such took place, and a suggested alliance with the Flemish Furskin of Moray during the 12th century. However, this may be, it is evident that Sir James Douglas inhabited the blood of his swarthy ancestors, whether he was a lineal descendant of the 8th century Douglas or not. Quite likely he was not, but only a scion of the same tree. Bourbon has enough to say of him from the days of his youthful throwlessness in the Paris down to the gallant death in Spain, but it's only with Barber's description of his complexion that we have to do here. And this, he says, was Sumdale gray, his hair being black. As already stated, Godscorf remarks that he is said to have been of a black and stork complexion, an expression somewhat stronger than that used by Barbour. This dusky skin earned for him, such the historians, the title of the Black Douglas. And although the good Sir James to his friend, he was such a terror to his foes that his most troublesome children could at once be hushed into good behavior by a single threat of a visitation from the dreaded bugbear, the Black Douglas. So say the run of historical writers, but without throwing any doubt upon the complexion of the good Sir James, it may be questioned whether this title was his particular property. There is, indeed, every reason to believe that it served no more to distinguish him from other Black Douglases than the black man would separate one out of the whole tribe of black men. We see this by looking at the chiefs of the clan, without even taking their followers into consideration, for not only was the good Sir James known as the Black Douglas, but so also was his grandson, a son of Archibald the Grim. So apparently was the 8th Earl of this line, who was killed at Stirling in the year 1452. King James II, more than this, it seems is very probable that Archibald the Grim, who has just been referred to, was really so called because he was Archibald the Black. All right, brothers and sisters, I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to try to find my book dealing with the Highlanders, all right, and then talk about those Black Scots here in America. So peace and love, brothers and sisters. Your brother G. 107. Let's go.